This is part 42 of my series on my N-gauge model railway project. Previous parts covered the project from its inception through the creation of the baseboard, selection and laying of track, building of scenic items, obtaining rolling stock, etc. The project is ongoing. This part deals with further revisions to the Kato motorized turntable in my yard area, adding more parking tracks to fully utilize all of the connections available on the turntable. When I last did a video on revision of the yard, this is what it ended up looking like, with 2 triple sheds, 2 single sheds, and 3 open parking tracks off the Kato turntable. It occurred to me that, whilst there was no room for any more sheds, it should be possible to squeeze in some more parking tracks. As previously, I tried first with paper templates, made based on the extension tracks that I already had. I figured that I could best put in the 3 straight extension tracks from another extension set as shown by the templates here. There's no requirement that the extension tracks all go on the same side. I could put a track and 2 buffers on one side and 2 tracks and 1 buffer on the other side, best using the available space. I've been progressively moving miscellaneous buildings that used to be in the yard area elsewhere, as the turntables expanded, so now I've got a sort of a little industrial area over here by the branch to the sidings from the outer loop. I bought another Kato turntable straight extension pack from Otter Valley Railroad in Tillsonburg, Ontario. This is the 3rd of these sets I've bought from them, and with this one I cleaned out their stock of this item. As mentioned before, the only way you can buy extensions to the Kato turntable is in the form of extension packs, straight or curved. And for most purposes, the curved extension pack doesn't make a lot of sense, as it comes with a 3-track connector but only 2 tracks. Kato don't sell any of the components individually. Here are the contents of the straight pack again: 3 extension tracks, 3 buffer tracks with some assembly required, 2 3-track connectors, and a bag of uni-connectors, including isolating connectors and half-size connectors for connecting in limited space. Having got the parts, the next thing was to mark out where the foam on the board had to be cut out to accommodate the new tracks. I did this simply by placing the tracks and drawing round with a pencil. Here I have drawn around 1 extension track and 2 buffer tracks, which is what I intend to place on this side. And then I draw around 2 extension tracks and 1 buffer track on the other side, producing this outline. Now I have to paint all of the components. This is rather fiddly and annoying, but when I first got the turntable I felt that it looked much too bright and shiny and really needed toning down and weathering to look in place in my yard. So the surfaces of all the components need to be painted, and also the sides where they come up above the board. The colour I use is actually Luftwaffe Grau-Violet that I had left over from aircraft modelling. I was told recently this whole line of colours has now been discontinued. Painting between the tracks and between the sleepers is tricky. I keep Q-tips on hand to quickly wipe off any paint that gets where it shouldn't be. It's important, of course, to ensure that paint doesn't get on the tracks and spoil electrical connections. Although you can, so long as you spot it, you can wipe it off. This is enamel paint. While the paint was drying, I got on with cutting out the top layer of foam from the board. I have taken off the cover and removed the screw holding down the cover where the new connector will go on the turntable. Screw and cover are placed in the pit so they won't get lost. You don't get any new screws with the extension set, so you better not lose the ones that come with the turntable. I've placed my flexible work light on the board so I can better see what I'm doing. Here I've cut all the way round the area of foam that needs to be removed. Then I used a steel ruler to gently pry the foam out, taking care not to put any pressure on the turntable itself, which could be fairly easily damaged. The brown at the bottom of the cavity is the construction adhesive that held the layers of the board together when it was originally built. And the same process is followed on the other side, cutting round this rather oddly shaped piece. and then removing it. Next, I cut pieces of dollar store foam board and fitted them into each of the holes to bring the components up to the right height. It's easier doing it this way rather than trying to cut out part of a layer of foam. Next, the buffer tracks were assembled. The bottom pieces and the little black buffer pieces are cut from the sprues that they come on, and then the black pieces are slotted into the bases. It's rather fiddly, but no glue is required so long as you don't break anything, although I must say these little buffers are quite fragile and I've ended up breaking several of them whilst working on the turntable, so I ended up repairing the broken ones with super glue. When the black pieces are slotted in, they create a buffer like this. It stops engines fine, but if you accidentally lean on it or put something on top of it, it will quite easily break. The little hook piece is pushed down into the slot, then you pull back to hook that under and push the pin into the hole at the back. Of course, it doesn't help that I've clogged the slots with paint, but really it's not much of a problem to push through that. And here are the 3 buffer tracks assembled. They have no electrical function, of course. They just stop locos running off the far side if you don't bring them to a halt in time. I put Kato buffers that I had on hand onto the ends of the 3 extension tracks, as I didn't have room in the yard to connect anything further. Next, I assembled the extension tracks and buffer tracks onto the 3-track connector pieces, arranged as I wanted to put them on the turntable. Half-size uni-connectors are used on one side where the extension tracks connect due to the limited space. I found that I didn't quite have room to fit everything in without one of the buffers going onto the road, so I cut off the back of it with a saw to make things fit. Here's how that cut-off buffer fits right up against the fence. And the single track and 2 buffers are fitted opposite on the other side. And now the new tracks are tested. It's very important that the connectors rest naturally in place without any stress, otherwise they could prevent the turntable from turning properly and damage it. Once I've verified that the table itself turns properly, I test the electrical functioning of the new tracks by running a loco onto them. In this case the Graham Farish Ginty, which tends to be my go-to loco for all sorts of utility tasks. And here's a Fowler 4F tender loco being turned onto one of the new tracks. And now the 4F is parked and the Ginty is on the table. When not in use, I always switch the turntable power to neutral and return the arm to the access track. So here's a top view of the table after this extension, and a slightly wider view showing the industrial area and the outer sidings also. Here's the turntable with the new tracks looking quite colourful, with a couple of Union Mills LNER engines in green and a Farish SDJR 4P in blue. Looking at the table like this, it seemed to me that I could still squeeze in 3 more tracks, though I'd have to make special arrangements about buffers on the ends of them, as there wouldn't be enough space for the regular Kato buffers, not even cut down. So I bought yet another extension set, this time from Credit Valley Railway in Mississauga in Ontario, as I'd cleaned out the stock of this item at Otter Valley. And again, the fitting started with marking out the area to be removed. In this case, I'll just be putting 3 buffers on this side and the 3 tracks on the other over by the road. As you can see, the tracks will fit over by the road without hitting the fence, but there's very little room at the ends of them. And again, with a rather fiddly and messy process of painting, my jar of Grau Violet is almost gone. But then again, there's no more room for expanding the turntable further after this. Everything's now painted, tricky doing the areas between the tracks especially. It's not a big problem if a bit of paint gets onto the sleepers so long as the rails remain clean. And now again with the cutting, just using a regular craft knife. And the pieces are pried out. The buffer tracks are fitted. If the connector doesn't go down into place easily, a bit more foam is removed, as it's very important that the turntable can turn smoothly without any binding. These tracks are a bit unusual, as I'm not really going to connect anything to their ends. They definitely sit too low with nothing underneath them. So I cut a piece of dollar store foam to raise them up. Now the ends of the tracks come level with the board. Next I just need to do something about buffers for their ends. I had some Pico buffer kits that I picked up from British Model Trains in Cambridge. These were really meant for fitting onto Pico track, of course, but I managed to adapt them to work here. On Pico track they can just snap together, but I had to superglue the crossbars on to use them here. Then I hooked the front legs of the buffers round the ends of the tracks, as intended for Pico track, and pushed the back legs down into the foam of the board, after first starting holes with the sharp end of a pair of tweezers. It's not exactly elegant, I guess, but I can live with it. So here we are. There are no covers left. All of the available spaces round the table are used by connectors, with a half circle of parking and shed tracks and a half circle of buffer tracks. As I say, it's not super elegant in some respects if you look closely, and I wouldn't rule out some attempts at cosmetic improvement in the future, but generally I'm fairly happy with the result. So now I've got room to store 17 locos in the yard, and of course I can turn locos to face whichever way is required for their duties, so long as I can figure it out. It's definitely a bit of a squeeze, but it sort of works. So here's a final view of the yard end of the layout, with all the track revisions, I think, finished for now.